Hello bookworms, it's Jade from Bedtime Bookworm and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm here with my June and July reading wrap-up. The reason why I'm doing a combined wrap-up of June and July is because I didn't finish any books in June. I did DNF one book in June, but I didn't finish anything. If you don't know, I had a really tough month in June just with some personal things that I had going on, so reading just didn't really happen that month. July was a much better reading month, and I have definitely gotten my reading mojo back. All I want to do now is read. Well, read and watch TV. So I'm going to be talking about a total of 6 books today. Before I tell you what those books are, this is how my ratings panned out. I did have one 2-star read. Like I said, I had a DNF in June. I also had one 3-star read. I had 3 4-star reads and 1 5-star read. In my wrap-ups, I like to look at how many books out of all of the ones that I read were part of a series, because I do have a reading goal for the year to read mostly books that are from series. Although honestly, I feel like my reading goals have kind of gone out the window with the kind of year 2020 has been. I'm just letting myself read whatever I want without thinking too hard about it. But I'm happy to say that out of these 6 books, so June and July combined, 5 of them were part of a series. One of those was the book that I DNF'd, which was the first book in a series, and I definitely won't be continuing on in that series. I did have 4 other books that were also series starters, which is not ideal considering I'm trying to cut down on the number of series that I'm reading, but like I said, my goals have kind of gone out the window and I'm just like reading whatever. But I did have one book that was a series ender, so that was good. Okay, the books that I'm going to talk about in this video include Forest of Souls, the first book in the Shamanborn series by Lori M. Lee, A Memory Called Empire, the first book in the, I don't know how to say it, Teixcalaan. I don't have it written down, that's just off the top of my head. And that is by Arkady Martine. The Last Argument of Kings by Joe Abercrombie, which is the last book in the First Law trilogy. The Girl of Fire and Thorns by Ray Carson, which is the first book in the Girl of Fire and Thorns series. Allegedy by Tiffany D. Jackson. And lastly, The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson, which is the first book in the Stormlight archives. I will have timestamps down in the description box where I talk about each of these books, so if you're only interested in hearing my thoughts on some of them, you can easily jump to the ones that you want to hear. I will also have linked in the description box the reading vlogs where I talked about these. Honestly, most of them I talked about in my most recent reading vlog, so for those of you who actually watch my reading vlogs, which I of course really appreciate, hopefully this isn't too repetitive, but I know not everybody watches reading vlogs and that's why I continue to do wrap-ups. Alright, let's jump right in. So in June, the one DNF that I had was Forest of Souls by Lori M. Lee. I actually received an e-advanced reader copy of this off of NetGalley, so thank you to the publishers for a free copy in exchange for an honest review. And sadly, like I said, I DNF'd this, which stands for I did not finish, which was a big bummer because I was really looking forward to it. Obviously, that's why I requested it on NetGalley in the first place. So this is a YA high fantasy, and I was interested in it because the author is an Asian author, and the world building and the magic system and things had some Asian inspirations, which is something that often draws me to books because, if you don't know, I'm half Korean. Right off the bat, from the very beginning, I could tell it just wasn't a good match for me. I had quite a few issues with the writing style and just the storytelling in general. I did read 25% of the book, which is a lot of times what I try to do before I make a decision about DNFing or not. One of the big red flags for me was the writing style, particularly the inner monologue of the main character. Basically, I thought there was way too much inner monologue. Often in books, I complained about the opposite problem, that there's not enough inner monologue, because when there's not enough inner monologue, I feel like I can't get to know the character very well, or I don't emotionally connect to them if I don't know, what's going on inside their head. But I definitely had the opposite problem with this book. And obviously this is a bit subjective. You know, people have different preferences for the amount of inner monologue that they like, but what I found happening in this book was that often there was so much inner monologue that I started thinking like, okay, but what is she like physically doing right now? Because she's been thinking about this for like 15 minutes at least, right? So like, she's just standing there. I just had thoughts like that multiple times within the first 25% of the book. I also found the world kind of like confusing and things weren't very well explained. Granted, I only got 25% in, but there were multiple red flags for me that this book wasn't going to work. And because this was my ebook at the time, which if you don't know, I read from an ebook almost every night. It's how I fall asleep. So I was just picking up this book every night before bed, and I was not enjoying it. I was dreading picking it up. I was dreading going to bed because I knew I was going to be reading this, and it wasn't working for me, and that is why I decided not to finish it. I do believe this is a debut author, so I hope this book finds an audience out there, but I'm sad to say that it was not for me. Okay, moving on to July. So the first book that I finished in the month of July was A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martine, which is the first book in a series. I'm not going to attempt to say the series name. This is an adult science fiction book, and I read this physically, which I got from my library. I was reading this because it was one of the BookTube SFF nominations, and I'd heard so many good things about it, so I definitely was really looking forward to it, and I was kind of disappointed when I ended up only giving it 3 stars. Which, by the way, I did say in my reading vlog that it was like a 3.5 that I rounded up to 4, but when I went and checked my Goodreads, I definitely had given it 3 stars, not 4, and I hadn't changed it, so I just misspoke in my reading vlog. Obviously, it was kind of like a borderline book, but the further I get away from it, the more comfortable I feel with rounding it down to 3. One of the things that I had been looking forward to in this book is people often talk about the political intrigue, and I definitely agree that there is a lot of politics in this book, but honestly, the politics went over my head, which isn't something that often happens. Like, I'm usually fairly good at catching on to political things, but sometimes I'm not. Sometimes things are written in a way that I find confusing, or, you know, sometimes it just goes over my head, and that's what I found in this book. I felt like this book was definitely a little more cerebral than what I enjoy reading. For me, reading is an escape, and if it's really confusing, then it kind of impedes in my enjoyment. And obviously not everybody is the same way. Some people really like having things that are difficult to understand and challenging things to read, and you know, some people probably don't even think this book was challenging to understand. But between the politics that I didn't really get, and also the world building, there's a lot of words that I had a hard time grasping. There is a glossary in the back that I did use, especially in the second half of the book when I realized that it was there, but it took me a long time to really grasp the world and the politics and what was going on, and I just spent so much of the book confused that it really impacted my reading experience. I'd say the last quarter of the book was quite good, and I enjoyed it because at that point I really had a better grasp of everything that was going on, but a book that takes me until the last quarter to enjoy, I feel like I can't really give more than 3.5 stars. I do think that people who are really into like languages and the way you translate words between languages would find this book interesting. That was one of the things that I liked about this book. As someone who is bilingual, when you speak 2 different languages, there's not always like an apples to apples comparison of words. I don't know if that was the right analogy, but you know, you can't always translate words exactly into different languages. They're just like slightly different because cultures are different and things like that. And I did find that part really interesting, and there's definitely a little bit of stuff about like colonialism and otherness of people who are of different cultures from you and things like that in this book that I thought was interesting. But all of that put together just wasn't enough for me to really enjoy it that much. I didn't hate it, but it was just okay. Because I had heard such good things about this book, I was quite a bit disappointed in it, but obviously this book is really well loved. I think it actually won a Hugo Award recently, so I'm definitely a bit of an unpopular opinion, but it just wasn't quite a good match for me. Okay, the next book that I finished in the month of July was The Last Argument of Kings by Joe Abercrombie, which is the last book in the First Law trilogy. I was reading this on audiobook, which I own. I purchased from Audible. I do highly recommend this series on audiobook. The narrator is fantastic and it does a really good job of giving the characters different voices and really bringing them to life. I also did this as a buddy read with my friend Graf. I did read all 3 of the books in this trilogy with him, which was a lot of fun. This is an adult high fantasy series that is quite popular. It's a grimdark series, and it centers around 4 or 5 different main characters. My biggest issue with the series prior to getting to this last book was just that the plot was kind of all over the place. There really wasn't much of a plot. It was kind of just about these different characters. I had been told that the last book would kind of tie everything together, and in some ways it did. It definitely tied up together much better than the prior 2 books, but my biggest issue in this last book was just the continuation of kind of being plotless. Like, there were things happening and I was struggling to kind of see the connection between things, and that part was really frustrating. However, these characters, I really enjoy most of them, or at least I find them interesting. And because of that, every time I picked up the book, I had a good time while I was reading it, but it was definitely one that I wasn't like itching to pick up when I wasn't actively reading it. All of the characters in the book are morally gray, some more than others. I will say that my favorite 2 characters are going to be Logan Ninefingers and Glokta, with Pharaoh as a close third. The other issue that I kind of had with this book is the ending. There were kind of multiple false endings, I felt like. Things kept happening and I was like, okay, this is the end. Oh wait, no, that's not the end. And it happened multiple times. Basically, all of the individual plots were being wrapped up and each of those kind of felt like an ending. And then the very end was the wrapping up of one character, and it honestly was kind of like a cliffhanger ending. And this is the end of a trilogy. Granted, there are other books in this world, but I don't think that this character is the main character in any of those other books. So I found that quite frustrating, that it kind of ended with a cliffhanger, or like maybe like an open ending, and you guys know how I feel about open endings. So I don't know, the ending kind of left a bit of a bad taste in my mouth. I just didn't love the ending. I did still give this book 4 stars, which might sound kind of high given how I've been talking about it, but I do really enjoy these characters and I did have a good time when I was reading it, but it definitely was lacking in a few areas for me. The next book that I finished in July was The Girl of Fire and Thorns by Ray Carson. Actually, I have a physical copy of this book that I own, but I actually did mostly listen to this on audiobook, which I had out from my library. This is the start of a YA fantasy series. This was actually one of my TBR jar picks, and I had been wanting to read it because I really enjoyed Ray Carson's Walk on Earth a Stranger trilogy, and this is the series that she released prior to that. And I think because this is an older example of her works, I think I didn't enjoy it quite as much. Her writing just hadn't quite matured to the level that it was in the Walk on Earth a Stranger trilogy. So the main character in this book is named Elisa, and she is a princess who was born with a godstone in her belly button, which means that she is destined to do something special. Nobody knows what it is until the person with the godstone does the thing, but it just means that she's special in some way. I thought the world building in this was interesting. There definitely seems to be a lot of like Spanish inspirations as well as like Catholic inspiration. I will say that I didn't love the Catholic inspiration. I've come to realize that I tend to be a little bit picky about religion in books, especially in fantasy books. I need them to be fairly different from religions in our own world, like Christianity or Catholicism, for me to really suspend my disbelief and to get really drawn into the world. And the similarities I saw in the religion in this world to Catholicism definitely impeded my enjoyment just a little bit. One thing that I really enjoyed about this book was the main character, Elisa. She is definitely one of those like smart and thoughtful main characters that really appeals to me. And she's also like a reluctant chosen one trope, and chosen one tropes, especially the reluctant chosen one trope, is one of my favorite things to read, and that definitely helped me to enjoy this book. There's definitely a bit of political intrigue and forbidden romance that I enjoyed in this book, and I had a really good time reading it. I just didn't quite love it like to a 5-star level, but I had a good time reading it, and I'm definitely going to continue on in the series. The next book that I finished in the month of July was Allegedly by Tiffany D. Jackson. This is a YA contemporary slash mystery thriller about a girl named Mary. It takes place when she is about 16, I believe, but when Mary was a young child, like about 5, she and her mother were babysitting a family friend's daughter who was white, and her and her mother are black. And while the baby was in their care, the baby died, and Mary is blamed for the death of this baby and ends up getting sent to jail. And when she gets older, she has to live in something like a halfway house. She's basically a ward of the state for the rest of her life, or until she turns 18. But when she's 16, she has a boyfriend and she gets pregnant, and she finds out that there's a good chance she won't be able to keep the baby. So the majority of this book is about Mary trying to better herself and get into a better situation so that she can keep the baby that she is pregnant with. I definitely want to give some content warnings in this book for child abuse, both emotional and physical, although the physical abuse isn't necessarily on page, but it is discussed. And there are also people in this book who have various mental illnesses. And honestly, I'm not really sure if that mental illness representation is really done well. That's not something I can really speak to, but I do feel that the people with mental illness weren't necessarily portrayed in the best light. Oh, I forgot to mention, I had this book out from my library physically, but I honestly mostly listened to the audiobook, which I listened to through Scribd, and I highly recommend the audiobook. The narrator is one of my favorites. It's Bonnie Turpin. If you have listened to any of her books, you know that she's a fantastic narrator, and she really brought this book and the characters to life for me. So I said it was kind of like a mystery thriller, and that's because you don't know what actually happened to the white baby that died until like the end of the book. That's why the book is titled Allegedly, because Mary allegedly killed this baby. And I did really find that mystery element enticing, and I was wanting to know what happened. This book also really explores a lot of like some of the systemic issues we have in the US, and how once you get into the jail system or become a ward of the state, how difficult it can be to get out of that. Mary works really hard in this book to get herself into a better situation because she really wants to be able to keep this baby. And she runs into roadblock after roadblock, and I found all of that really eye-opening and interesting. Unfortunately, the ending of the book didn't quite work for me. I think if the book had ended differently in a way that I enjoyed more, I would have given this book 5 stars. I read the last half of this book in the span of like less than 48 hours. Just once I passed the halfway mark, I could hardly put it down. It was really good, and I wanted to know what was going to happen, and then I ended up being kind of disappointed with the ending. I just felt like the way this book ended kind of negated some of the messages of the book, and I just really didn't appreciate that. Especially because I had been so emotionally connected with Mary, and just the ending fell really flat for me. I did still really enjoy my time reading it, and I thought it was a fun story. It is a bit of an issues book, so it feels weird to call it a fun book. But I did enjoy it, and I ended up giving this book a 4-star rating. Alright, that brings me to the last book that I finished in the month of July, and it was my 1 5-star read. That is The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson, the first book in the Stormlight archives. I did read this book about 10 or maybe 8 years ago. Because it had been so long since I had read it, I really only had vague memories. So even though it was a reread, it was also a bit of a fresh read for me. I hadn't planned on reading the Stormlight archives like now. I wanted to wait until closer to the first arc being finished. If you don't know, this is going to be a 10-book series, but the first 5 are meant to kind of go together and be a complete arc, and then there's going to be a second arc in the second 5. So I planned on waiting until close to when the 5th book was coming out so that I could read them all together and not have to do a lot of rereading and things like that. But I changed my mind when I heard about the Stormalong 2020. It is a read-along of the series. They are reading 1 book every 2 months until the 4th book, which is coming out in the fall, comes out, and there are live shows to discuss each book at each 25% mark. I did miss the first 2 live shows for the 25 and 50%, marks because I was behind the reading schedule, but then I caught up for the 75% and the live show for the ending of the book, and I had so much fun participating in those live streams. If you're interested in some of my more spoilery specific thoughts, go check out those live streams. And I will, of course, link the playlist of the read-along down in the description box. Anyways, if you haven't heard of this series, it is an adult high fantasy series, and I could talk about this book for so long, but I'm going to try and keep my thoughts fairly short. First of all, I think this book is the reason why I came out of my reading slump. It was my main book that I was reading for a lot of July, and I really loved being able to completely immerse myself in this world, which world building is one of Sanderson's strengths, and I absolutely love this world. It is so unique. Not only is like the magic unique, but even like the plant life and animal life that is in this world is just so different from anything that I've read before, and I really love that. And also, I just really jive well with Sanderson's writing style. It reminds me a lot of Robert Jordan's writing, which obviously you guys know I love, but I actually feel that Sanderson's writing is better. It's like it takes all of the things that I love about Robert Jordan's writing, but it's a little bit tighter. It's not quite as description heavy, although I know some people think there's still a lot of description. I just really love his writing. It feels cozy to me, and it's really easy for me to totally immerse myself. One thing that I think is really interesting about this book is, as much as I complained about the First Law trilogy being really plotless, this book also doesn't really have a plot, or it does definitely more than any of the books in the First Law trilogy, but especially in the first half of it, there's these different storylines going on and you don't really know how they're gonna connect. I don't know if it's just that I had read this book before and I knew that I would like it or what, but I didn't have any issue with there not being much of a plot in the beginning. I just was immediately drawn into the world and fell in love with the characters, well, most of them, from the very beginning. From my first read, I remembered the main characters of Kaladin and Dalinar. There is also a third character you get a lot of some POVs from. Her name is Shallan, and I honestly didn't remember her at all from my first read. She was very, I guess, forgettable. I didn't enjoy her storyline that much. Kaladin and Dalinar remain my favorite characters in that order. Kaladin first, Dalinar second. Kaladin is a bit of a reluctant chosen one. He's also often described as like a sad boy, which maybe I shouldn't put that in air quotes because it is quite clear that he has depression. Kaladin, I mean, he's had terrible things happen to him in his past. At first glance, it might seem like that's why he's a depressed person, but actually, if you read more closely, his depression is mentioned from childhood, from before bad things started happening to him, and that's something that I really enjoyed about Sanderson's writing. But he often includes characters who deal with mental health issues, which I just find really refreshing and realistic. There's so many fantasy books where terrible things happen to people, and they are able to handle it without really blinking, and I just find that so unrealistic because obviously when terrible things happen to you, regardless of if it's in a made-up world or a real world, there are mental health repercussions of that, and Sanderson does a really thoughtful job of including that kind of thing, and I really appreciate that. The last 75% of this book was so good. If you guys know Sanderson's writing at all, you know he has like these epic endings. There were a ton of reveals at the end that were super interesting and really fun to dissect in those live streams that I mentioned. So if you have read this book, I definitely recommend checking out those live streams. Alright guys, I have chattered on way too long. Those are all of the books that I read in June and July. If you have read any of these books, let me know what you thought of them down in the comment section, or let me know what your favorite book that you read in the last 2 months were. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more bookish content. That is all I have for now. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bookworms, keep reading. Bye.